Good evening, Captain Retired Matt Edwards here with the next installment of the Observation Post Facebook Live weekly broadcast. 23rd of February 2023, and last week I was feeling tired, forgot about it, so I said the heck with it. Apologies if people were expecting me to be on, but I almost just didn't feel like it. Next thing you know, I looked at it, it was 8:30, and usually I do these at 8 o'clock in the evening on Thursday. Anyway, without further ado, number 208, breach of trust by a public officer. Now, this is a criminal code offense, and I might have meant to add more to it. The only example I have here is that taxing disabled people on non-periodic payments in express violation of Income Tax Act Section 61F. Now, what I mean is, people that work for the government are public officers. Now, public officers are expected to obey the law. Now, the law requires a periodic payment, and they're taxing payments that are lump sums. People might say, well, what's the big deal? Well, they're ignoring the law. It could be Criminal Code Section 126, which is violation of a federal law, but the government probably won't want to charge people within the government for breaking the law that it passed. Now, that's a common theme that I always come back to, is the government has a very bad habit of creating a law and then ignoring the law that it created. For example, Canadian Forces Superannuation Act, Section 83, that is supposed to protect a Canadian Forces retiree, a veteran, their property, their money. It's not income, but it's supposed to protect their property from any creditor. But instead of that, the government takes it into account for the Service Income Support Insurance Plan, and Veterans Affairs takes it into account to reduce their payments under the income replacement benefit. Now, in reality, what should be happening is that it shouldn't be taking those payments into account, because the law, Section 83 of the Canadian Forces Superannuation Act, it prohibits what they're doing. But they ignore it. That could be breach of trust by a public officer, as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, because I don't want to be here all night, especially, sometimes it takes a fairly big effort to, do this stuff, because it doesn't seem like I'm getting anywhere. Most of it is just to alert people and an information campaign, but, Big Brother has so much more power than I do, so they keep getting away with things. On that note, it's not a poor me, say, whatever, but I was watching a program about the Russia invasion of Ukraine, and they were talking about the role of propaganda and disinformation. So if the truth is this, and they bring in all these specious arguments, these stupid arguments, until people throw up their hands and say, well, I don't know what's what, then they win. Because what was clearly a fact is now cloudy. And this is the way that a lot of this stuff is. The payment of a payment to be taxed under the Service Income Support Insurance Plan has to be periodic. The word in the act says periodic. So when they tax something that isn't a periodic payment, they're breaking the federal law. But they try to say that it's okay. Okay, point number 209, mandamus, is a writ that I hope to obtain when this goes to trial. But I was thinking, who do I ask for it against? My thoughts are that the judiciary must order the executive to obey the legislative law. You see, I'm doing a recap. I'll do a recap here, but Canada's supposed to have, just like the states and other democracies, 3 branches of government, and each one of the branches is supposed to keep an eye on the other 2. So, if the lawmakers pass something that was dumb, the legislators and the courts are supposed to stop them. If the legislators pass a law and the executive or the judiciary don't, listen to it, then they're supposed to kick up a stink. Because the lawmakers are supposed to pass laws because that's their job. Now, the courts, they're supposed to keep an eye on the other 2, but it seems to me that the government views itself like, I've gone to my member of parliament and I've told them about this problem or that problem, and they seem to want to back up the departments. Now, I've been trying to buck the system for a long time, and people might think that's crazy, but you shouldn't have to accept mistakes and stupidity. I've dealt with at least 21 government departments when I counted it up 5 or 6 years ago. Then I counted up how many departments there were, and there was 210. So I've dealt with personally about 10% of the Canadian government, and they have never gotten it right. Now you might think that that's awful egotistical, but the thing is that, okay, for example, I sent a complaint into the, I forget the name of it, there's some kind of ethics type commission. I was complaining about Canada Revenue Agency, how they treated me when I worked there. I obtained the report of the investigator under the Privacy Act, and the guy said to the chairperson who makes the decision, the investigator said, this guy, the complainant, said he's going to sue Canada Revenue Agency, and that is an act of bad faith. So therefore, I say that you should throw out his complaint. Now, if someone wrongs you and they have a duty of care, because you have to sue, in order to sue someone, they have to owe you a duty of care. So if someone owes you a duty of care and breached it, and then you resort to the courts to sue them, that is not an act of bad faith. The act of bad faith is the one who breached the duty, not the person who resorted to legal action to try and fix it. So them assholes could have helped me, feel like everybody's not out against me, if they had said, he has a point here. He's thinking about going to court, but, we can do an investigation too. I mean, it's not an act of bad faith to sue someone who's wronged you. But instead, this investigator either knowingly or was too stupid enough to know that a lawsuit against your former employer, well, first of all, it's hard to do. I was in a union, allegedly, so therefore you have to go through the union process. The only reason I could sue the government is because they screwed up my union dues. They changed my union from one union to another. The Professional Institute of Public Service of Canada became my union on the 12th of December 2001. But before that, it had been the Public Service Alliance Canada. Now, when that happened, CRA stopped my dues from going to PSAC and were supposed to remit them to PIPS. But they didn't. And then they left me in PSAC even though I was officially in PIPS. So I think these people kept, things under wraps by keeping me confused, by doing all this shit, when they could have just done their jobs and done it fairly and done it honestly. Anyway, mandamus is when you ask the courts to give you an order to obey the law. So in the previous example in point number 208, I was talking about the Canadian Forces Superannuation Act, Section 83, being breached by the Service Income Support Insurance Plan, the Department of National Defense, and the Department of Veterans Affairs under the Income Replacement Benefit. So if somebody went to court, they would ask the judge for a writ of mandamus to enforce Section 83 of the Canadian Forces Superannuation Act, which was passed by Parliament to protect pensions, which works with the Financial Administration Act, Section 67. And if the judge accepted, they would order the government to obey the law they passed. Because if we are expected to obey the law as citizens of Canada, why should the government pass laws and then promptly ignore it? It takes away, this is the big picture, from our trust in democratic principles. It's called the rule of law. If they ignore the law that they create, then they are setting a bad precedent. They are setting a bad example, and they shouldn't do it under any circumstances. They should steer so far away from breaking the law that they made, they should err on the side of caution. They shouldn't argue, for example, my member of Parliament said, the law is open to interpretation. Well, if they take that argument and lose, they could end up in jail. The reason I say that is that disobeying a federal statute is a criminal offense, Section 126 of the Criminal Code. So, if they argue they didn't break it based on their interpretation, and then the courts interpret it differently than the way they want to interpret it, they're risking their freedom. But again, the government has to charge people with that, and I don't see them charging themselves. I just don't. Right? I'm more than a little cynical about this shit. Okay. Point number 210. Legitimate expectations again, because I'm sure I've talked about it before. You may or may not remember. My Sun Life, which is really the Treasury Board supported Treasury Board of Secretariat long-term disability plan for the federal unionized employees, is probably behind on the one-page form I got to fill out. Like every year they send me a form instead of making me go to the doctor, and they ask me to say if I'm still disabled. Should I have a legitimate expectation? Excuse me, I'm a whistle a bit. That I should continue to receive my long-term disability insurance that I paid for with my premiums? Because that's the way it works. At about 2 years, they review your file to see if you're too disabled to work with a different definition. For the first 2 years, it's your own job, your own position, your own employment. But at the 2-year mark, they're supposed to look at your ability to do a job equal to 67% of your former pay. Now, if you can do, in their estimation, a job that pays, say, 70% of your old job, then they can say, even if you're still disabled, that, I'm sorry, you're cut off. All right? So that is a very subjective test. But Sun Life decided, after they cut me off for a bit and then I appealed and whatever, but they put me back on it until age 65. Now, if I'm on it till age 65 because I met their definition, why do I have to continue to produce this one-page form that they send me each year? Now, on the Army side, the Service Income Support Insurance Plan make people do, at least they used to, an annual medical examination. Now, I've waxed on poetically, at least I hope I have, in the past about this bullshit, because if you're in the military, you have to do a medical exam every 5 years under age 40 and every 2 years after age 40. Now, why should you have to do an annual medical for their long-term disability after you have no longer any requirement to provide service to Canada? So it doesn't conform to their normal procedures for soldiers that are still serving. That's one point. Now, the other point is that this is obviously a way to try to piss off the person and make them quit, doing it and not get their insurance, which is what happened to me. Or they're just hoping for a flyer. They got hoping that the doctor will say every year, if they keeps doing it, maybe the doctor will say, but he's not disabled anymore. Right? So I view these as annual reapplications. Okay? So you're not getting an annual medical. They're asking you to confirm your disability every year, which is like a new application. Now, Manulife, just like Sun Life, had decided that I had fit the definition for payments after 2 years, and they had said I would get it till age 65. So there is the legitimate expectation. Now, the term I'm using, it's a phrase, it's a legal phrase, okay? So, do I have the right to expect my insurance without interruption? That's the question. Or can they interrupt my payments anytime they see fit? Because I don't think that that's the purpose of insurance. If they say, for example, what they'll say if they already haven't said it, or if you can't figure out what they're saying, how do we know you're still disabled, to say? Well, the first thing I would say to them, fuckers, is that, well, hang on now. Have you received any information about my Canada Pension Plan disability that you forced me to get? So I think that'll be a pretty good indicator of whether I'm still disabled, is, am I still receiving these payments that you're clawing back from your payments? So if I'm still getting the Canada Pension Plan disability, you can rest the fucking sure that I am still disabled, you son of a bitches. Now, that's obvious. The other thing I would say, and I've said this before, is that, how much do you trust your own sense of judgment? They'd say, well, we trust ourselves implicitly. We 100%. Well, I could say, well, back in 2014, at the 2-year mark, I was assessed by Manulife for the Government of Canada, the Department of National Defence, to see if I would continue to get payments past the first 24 months. Now, your company assessed me, judged me, certified me as being too disabled to continue working until age 65. Now, yet, you cut me off in 2017 after 4 years of receiving the payments. Now, what evidence did you have that I was not disabled? And, why would, a medical assessment in subsequent years, why would that reveal anything different than your assessment in 2014? Tell me that now, pray tell. See, the problem we have is that people think that they're right. Manulife tells them to do something and they don't think anything of it. But they're not working on your behalf. They're trying to save money for the government. They might be trying to save money for Manulife too, but really it's supposed to be the government because it's the government's insurance plan. Now, point number 211. Should someone start a class action on the 2016 earnings loss benefit problem that many had with respect to the 20% more? Now, this is an issue I discovered when I was trying to help Corporal Retired Tom Anderson over in Cape Ray, Newfoundland. And he had, I was trying to help him out with various things, including his taxes. Seeing he was talking to me, he said to me, Matt, they're supposed to change the ELB to 90% soon. How much should I expect to get? Now, this is where this legitimate expectations comes in again. So I said, listen, how much are you getting right now? $4,000 a month, roughly. Okay, well, they're increasing the payment, I said, between 75 to 90%. Now, 15 over 75, 15 is the difference in the new and the old rates. Put the 15 over the original rate, and you have a 1 in 5, anyway, it's 1 over 5 fraction, which is 0.2, which is 20%. So 20% times $4,000 is $800 a month. You should expect about $800 a month more from Veterans Affairs Canada to top up the Service Income Support Insurance Plan. He got a check for $1.59. $1.59. Okay? He wasn't the only one. CBC did a story in July of 2017, and they said there were 139 people that got a check for about $1.39, $1.59, something in that range. Now, if you're getting a 20% increase by my calculations, now everybody else will say it was a 15% increase because it went from 75 to 90, which is 15. But I still think it's a 20% change. So if you have a 20% change in the amount of money you're getting, and it's based on your military salary before release, right? So you should be able to calculate it out fairly quickly. It's not rocket science. But something went wrong with either the computer or the people administering the alleged benefit, because it was an awful lot of people didn't get the right amount according to my calculations. Now, I don't have these payments. I can't sue. It's not my problem, except that I know about it. So somebody might need to take the government on about that one of these days. They might need to sue the government on what happened? Why did you fuck up? Get them to admit that they did fuck up in the first place, because they will say, we didn't do anything wrong, which is what they said when we contacted the government about Tom's problem. Anyway, last point for tonight, because my eyes are getting a bit blurry, short and sweet today. I was half mind to do a quick one to make up for the one I missed last week, but it's easy to put it off because, I'm not in the best of health. On that note, for example, a short insight into my own problems and personality. I had a hot water problem with the stripped bathtub handle 4 months ago. Finally got a plumber in to fix it yesterday. So we kept putting it off for 4 months, and we had no hot water from the last 4 days between Sunday and Wednesday. That was why I decided to finally call the plumber. Anyway, like I said, I keep putting things off, procrastinating. I got ADHD, which is procrastination as a very key feature. a lot of times you get adrenaline going near a deadline or something when you keep putting it off. Anyway, point number 212, last point. Did I already compile a pension table, or should I? Now, I often find myself doing things again. I did it once, forgot about it, get it in my head to do something, and I find I already did it after I waste time doing it up again. What I was thinking about doing, if I haven't already done it, is to put a table into, like, what kind of pension it is, like Canadian Forces Superannuation, and what is the rate. You know, the accrual rate is 2% per year, times a maximum of 35 years, you know, and that's how you figure out how much of a pension you should get. And then, is it indemnity or non-indemnity? Well, if a payment is meant to compensate you for a loss, then it's an indemnity payment. So you could put yes or no under that column. Does it have laws protecting it? And then you could I could list the number of the Act, Section 83 of the Canadian Forces Superannuation Act, right? That is the law that is supposed to protect Canadian Force members, veterans' pensions. For the Canada Pension Plan, it would be Section 65(1). Now, the thing is, they shouldn't be allowed, like one of the columns will be, is this property? The answer to all pensions will be yes, because it was already at the court in 1990. Clark versus Clark, Supreme Court of Canada case was about a couple, you know, one of them was a Canadian Forces veteran and his ex, and the question put before the courts was, is this pension, the Canadian Forces Superannuation Act pension, is it income or property? That was the 50-50 question. At the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal, it was said to be income. Someone appealed, it went to the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Supreme Court of Canada overruled the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal and said, I'm sorry, it's not income, it's property. Now, a lot of people, if you've gone through a divorce or something, or if you heard about that, if you know people that have gone through divorce, you find out that pensions are property and they have to be divided in a divorce. So that makes sense because, well, that was the Supreme Court of Canada ruling, and pensions are property, and if it's family property, it has accrued during the family's, living together, then it has to be divided accordingly. But that don't sit well with people. Some people think that pensions are income. Well, they lost the court case. There is no middle ground. I asked McInnes Cooper lawyer this. He was running for to be my member of Parliament, and I wanted to see how good he was, so I was talking to him, and I asked him, what about pensions being property or income? He said it can be both. Well, not according to the Supreme Court of Canada ruling in 1990. It is one or the other. It can't be both. So why do people continue to believe that pensions are income? The Canada Pension Plan, that's not income, it's property. The Canadian Forces pension, the Public Service pension, the RCMP pension, even if you have, say, a Newfoundland and Labrador Teachers Association, you could be a teacher or something, or you could be anything, a company pension, they're all property. Which reminds me, and I know I meant to shut up, but it was about the Canada Pension Plan and the Public Service, RCMP, and the Canadian Forces pensions being integrated back in 1964, and a guy in the opposition asked Minister Judy LaMarche, he said, well, what happens if a public servant becomes disabled? And then they're going to get the Public Service Superannuation Act Disablement Pension. Will they also get the Canada Pension Plan Disability Disablement Pension? She said, yes, of course. Now, I'm reading a lot of sarcasm in there because everybody should know that pensions are property. She said if he has 5 or 6 pensions, he'll get them all. And that's the way pensions are supposed to work. If you have a 30-year career, Company A, 5 years, Company B, C, D, E, F, and G, F, 6 companies, 5 years each. Each one of those pensions has a vesting period of 2 years, say. So after 2 years, you can't get their money back. It's locked in until they retire. So even though he worked at 6 companies for 5 years, at the end of his career, he'll get 6 pensions. They're not allowed to say, oh, he's getting money from over there. That doesn't matter. What matters is that they get their money back, because pensions are deferred pay. the company, the employer, decides to pay you some now and some later. And the difference of how much now and how much later is often negotiated in a contract or something. But with the government, it's not. They say that you're going to get a defined benefit pension of 2% accrual rate times X number of years. Like if you had 35 years, that'd give you 70%. And then it'll be multiplied times your at best, 5 years average salary. Some companies don't have that. And the Reserve Force Pension Plan uses 1.5% of the entire period, which is entirely irregular and not fair. Because if the public service, RCMP, and the Canadian Forces pensions has 70% maximum times your best 5 year salary, why should you have to base the pay over your entire career in the reserves? They're obviously trying to get their foot in the door to changing the rules so they can change the other pensions later. And they'll say, well, they're doing that in the Reserve Force Pension Plan, so let's change the Canadian Forces pension and the public service. And the other one, nobody kicked up a stink. We got away with it. So now let's change it to like that for all of it. Now, that's kind of like what I figure. Last point, I said that before, but fun fact, did you know that the Service Income Support Insurance Plan used to be a lifetime payment? From 1969 to 1995, it was a lifetime payment if you got disabled and then got your insurance. But I think they were floating a trial balloon in 1995 when they canceled it being a lifetime payment, and they said it would end at age 65. Now, 11 years later, they brought in the earnings loss benefit, and because they copied it from the Service Income Support Insurance Plan, instead of it being a lifetime payment, it ended at age 65. In the 2004 Veterans Affairs Canada review report or something like that, before the new Veterans Charter came in, they said, well, if they had brought in the earnings loss benefit in 1995 or earlier, then it would have been a lifetime payment. Now, that's awful naive to think that that was what would have happened. But they're trying to apply the rules just based on thinking people will follow the rules and not try to make things skewed towards their own savings, their own self-interest. Because that's what the government is doing with clawbacks. If the government of Canada wants to claw back the Canada Pension Plan from the Public Service, Canadian Forces, and the RCMP pensions, they're preferring their own interest by reducing their pension costs because of another pension at your expense. Now, that's not supposed to happen. When you have someone who's administering a pension, they are supposed to take the interest of the pensioner as their top priority. But the bridging laws don't do that. The bridging laws, Section 11.2 of the Public Service Superannuation Act, Section 15.2b of the Canadian Forces and the RCMP Superannuation Acts, those laws snuck in there because I haven't been able to find where they got passed into law. So somehow the government put these bridging sections into the statutory law, and it affected people's property rights. Now, property rights are supposed to be under Section 92.13 of the Constitution Act, provincial, and exclusively provincial. So if you want to pass a law to change someone's property and civil rights, you have to be the province. Now, the Canadian Forces, RCMP, and the Public Service Superannuation Acts are federal law. So these laws are, in my opinion, unconstitutional. So unless the government can prove they have the right to make these laws and show us where these laws came from, who did this? Was it put in there by flunkies that were not elected? Did, say, the Department of Justice or someone suggest under an administrative review, because every so many years they review the laws and they consolidate them, did they or did someone change the law to put those bridging sections in there? Because I don't see how they could do that, if they had open debate. I think people would kick up a stink, especially the unionized employees of the public service. Why would they allow the government to steal the money of their former employees. Well, I'll tell you why. Because the former employees don't pay union dues, and therefore the union don't give a shit about them. That's the sad fact of the matter. Anyway, I'm going to call her quits there because about a 20, 25, 30 minutes, and I'll talk to you, see you next week. Hopefully people will still tune in and try to talk to other people about this stuff. And let's see if we can get this fixed one of these days. Thanks for watching.